Welcome to our next installment in our lecture series for American Economic History online here at Rutgers University. And in this video, we're going to take a look at Chapter 26 in your book, The Prosperity of Wartime. In particular, we're going to take a look at the economy in the United States during World War II. And as a backdrop, remember we were in the 30s and the Great Depression, a depression that lasted for pretty much the entire decade. So we wanted to take a look at the impact of World War II, in particular, the constraints that were placed on resources. So let's take a look at this moving forward. So we want to get a basic understanding of the mobilization of resources that was necessary in order to produce the items that were needed for a war. So we're talking about the utilization of resources, but we're also taking a look at finance. In particular, how did the United States finance World War II? And we also want to take a look at what was the impact of the war on the labor markets, consumption, and investment. So we want to take a look at the important changes, and it's sort of looked at as World War II as a watershed moment, particularly in labor, where the roles in the labor force dramatically changed, where women became more and more important a component in the labor force. And we want to take a look at what the impact of the war was on consumption, and then also what the impact of the war was on investment. All right, so realize that we ended up having what is referred to as a command economy. And a command economy is where the federal government directs a majority of the resources in the economy. Because of the needs of wartime efforts, the government had first claim on resources. So instead of being a market-based economy, we were in a command economy where the federal government was directing where resources would go. And realize that you would think that this might have some constitutionality issues. But remember, this was a time of war, a time of national defense, and there are conditions where in the name of national defense, things that, particularly when there's a national emergency, that things that are constitutional and laws that are constitutional that would not be constitutional under ordinary circumstances. And I want you to realize that there was a whole host of administrations that were set up. For example, the NDAC, the National Defense Advisory Commission, was an organization that was in charge of mobilization in general. So that was the commission that was in charge of organizing resources that were available. So there would be sub-organizations, but the NDAC, the National Defense Advisory Commission, was the directing arm of the federal government in trying to utilize the resources most efficiently. There was also the National Defense Research Council. This was to mobilize research personnel, individuals with a technology base that would help do research and development, for example, for new arms, or as occurred in the United States in the development of atomic weapons, were underneath the umbrella of the National Defense Research Council. Also, we have the War Production Board. All right, that was their responsibility to prioritize and allocate resources. So make sure you remember that about the War Production Board. That was the board that set priorities on what resources were needed and allocated those resources accordingly, depending upon how important they were. And we also had the Office of Price Administration, which set up price controls. All right, so I want you to realize that the federal government was involved in regulating prices. It did not allow the market, did not allow supply and demand to set prices. Prices were set by a centralized organization. So much of this is much different than what we've talked about in the United States, where much of the coordination of resources was left to the market. during war times, we see this federal government take greater and greater responsibility. And as we saw from when we looked at the section or the chapter on the New Deal, we see that, and in the 30s, the federal government was getting more and more involved in the economy. So in World War II, it just makes natural sense that that progression would continue, and the government would control more and more resources and have more control over economic systems than they did previously. So let's take a look at how military expenditures expanded from 1940 to 1947. If we take a look, in 1940, military expenditures were less than $2 billion. In 1941, this grew to over $6 billion, in 42 to $23 billion, and in 43 to $63 billion. So you could see how the military was a very, very small component of expenditures in the United States before the war. And you can see how important the military gets. By 1945 and even by 1944, even in 43, 1/3 of the expenditures in the United States were military expenditures. And this is reflected in the fact of what happened to the military. All right, in 1940, we had 458,000 people in the armed forces, and this increased almost to 2 million by 41. And by the end of the war, there were 12 million people on active service in the United States. All right, and as you can see, the non-agricultural labor force is growing during this time period also. So again, we start seeing a dramatic shift away from agriculture and into non-agricultural labor force uses. Also take a look at what happens to the unemployment rate. And we talked about roughly 25% unemployment in 1932, 33, roughly in that area. What do we see with unemployment as we move into World War II? We see a dramatic decrease. It's 10% in 1940, falling to 6% in 1941, and then falling all the way down to 1.2% in 1944. All right, so I want you to realize that the impact of the war and how much the military took up in terms of resources and employment. All right. So in the financial end, how is the federal government going to finance the war? And realize that the war means that they have to have command of resources, particularly income, but it's going to have to spend in a much greater level than it has the ability to tax. So this necessitated that we would have to, number one, the United States would have to borrow money on a grand scale. As you saw by how much military expenditures increased, we were not going to tax it to finance as we were going along with the war. We're going to have to borrow money in order to do that. So we see that the importance of borrowing, and also the fact that we're going to see the money supply increase during this time period also. So let's take a look at what happens with the deficit. And as you can see, the deficit is relatively small in 1940. And actually we have a surplus in 41, but we could see the scope of the deficit, how much it increases, almost to $30 billion. All right, and you can see also, if we take a look, that there's a dramatic increase in expenditures. The government was spending about $8.5 billion, and by 1945 it was spending almost 10 times that amount, roughly 9 times the amount that it was in 1940. This was partially offset by the fact that receipts increased, taxable revenues increased by roughly 5-fold. So we see that the federal government is raising 5 times the amount of revenues, but expenditures are outpacing that. Expenditures are increasing roughly at a rate of 9-fold during that time period. So that's going to necessitate the fact that there is going to be a budget deficit. And you can see what happens to the debt. The deficit is just a yearly figure, the difference between the receipts in 1 year and the expenditures. The debt is just the summation of all previous deficits. And you can see what happens. The deficit the debt explodes in the United States. A five-fold increase in the debt owed by the United States during that time period. All right, and you can see also where's a major source of that money that's coming in? Income tax receipts. 19-fold increase in income taxes paid by individuals during that time period. And what do we see with the money supply? A threefold increase, well, I'm sorry, not a threefold, a 2.5-fold increase in the money supply during this time period. So I want you to realize that a portion of the financing that occurred from, that was needed for financing the war effort came from increases in taxes. Those increases in taxes did not keep pace with the increases in expenditures, which meant that we ran a deficit. The United States ran a deficit for every year during the war during that time period. And realize that the receipts increased in a large part due to the fact that we see income tax receipts increasing dramatically during this time period, but also we see a dramatic increase in the money supply during that same time period. What do we see with regard to interest rates? All the way through the 30s, we see that interest rates are declining going into 1941, and they remain relatively stable. All right, government notes remained relatively stable. T-bills we see increasing during the time period. So there was some upwards pressure on interest rates, particularly the 3-month T-bill amount. Government bonds, we did see a spike in roughly 42, it looks like, where bond rates increased, but then they moderated down towards the end of the war. But after the war, I want you to realize that interest rates start to move upward in the post-war period. Taxes. All right, we already discussed this a little bit. We do have to divert resources. Resources that were in the pockets of consumers now has to be transferred over to the federal government. So the government has to have some type of control over those resources to pay for the war effort. And as I discussed previously, there was a 5-fold increase in revenues and 8-fold increase in expenses. So we have to run a deficit. It was politically expedient. You could not raise taxes at any higher rate because then you end up alienating individuals in the economy. Those individuals might be upset with they're willing to pay a certain amount higher in taxes in order to finance the war effort, but if you try to finance the entire war effort through taxes, that might be very difficult to do, so you rely on lending to make up the difference. But I want you to realize too that this had a dramatic impact, World War II, on labor, in particularly levels of participation. Individuals and the patterns of participations changed. All right, newer age groups and genders, females in particular, became more and more important. There's the old character from World War II called Rosie the Riveter, whose job was to rivet steel plates together, a job that was considered to be a male-dominated occupation. Women were moving more and more into occupations that were traditionally thought of to be the exclusive domain of men. So I want you to realize that with the fact that we had, number one, we had so many males between the ages of 18 and 30 being called up for military service, that portion of the labor force was virtually non-existent. So that labor had to be made up with different groups. So it came up with different age groups, younger people getting involved in the labor force, older people getting involved in the labor force, but also with the fact that females took a much greater role in the labor force, particularly in occupations that were exclusively male prior to World War II. So let's take a look at, for example, we could say that in 16, 19-year-olds, the participation rates for 16 and 19-year-olds increased. After the war decreased, that went down to 67. So let's take a look. You can see the participation rates for example, 20 to 24-year-olds. Almost 100% in 44, and that declined after the war. So you can see that younger and younger people were involved in the war effort. Also, we can see that older individuals were getting involved in the labor force also. All right. We also, but the other thing is, I want you to realize that in the plus 65, you see a dramatic drop from 40 to 44, mostly due to the impact of Social Security. Older individuals didn't have to work because of Social Security. All right. And females, well, I want you to realize that females became a much more important component of the labor force during that time period. Also, realize what happened to people's wages. Uh, Wages increased across the board for individuals. Also, farmers shared in the growth of income, where farmers were doing worse and worse during the Great Depression. That trend started to reverse itself during World War II. All right, and also in the time of war, what happens, we see the income distribution changes. It becomes a more equitable distribution of income. As wages increased faster than the inflation rate for middle class workers, they became better off. And as tax rates, particularly progressive tax rates, fell on individuals with higher incomes, that decreased the inequity in the distribution of income in the economy of the United States. So if we take a look, these numbers give a pretty good picture. For example, annual earnings for all industries increases. If we take a look at agriculture, fishing, and forestry, we see actually a threefold increase, a double for all industries, but for agriculture we see a threefold increase. Mining, we see roughly a doubling of annual income per employee. Construction, we see a doubling, and in manufacturing, we roughly see a doubling. Same thing for services. So I want you to realize that during the war, that prosperity was pretty much evenly distributed for individuals. All sectors of the economy were doing better, and individual earnings were up across all different industries. Consumption. All right, income distribution. I'm sorry, that should be income distribution up there. And the Gini coefficient gives a measure of inequality of income. The higher the Gini coefficient, or the closer it is to 1, the more unequitable the distribution. And you can see that from 29 all the way through, we see that the distribution, the Gini coefficient, is falling from 29 through 44. So this gives us an indication, and you can see particularly fewer and fewer people are responsible for the top 25% of 20% of income, and the same holds for the top 5%. So the way to read this is, for example, in 1929, the top 5 earners in the economy were producing 30% of the wealth, or holding 30% of the income that individuals had. So the top 5 earners had 30% of the income. And you can see that that top 5% was gradually falling during that time period. The same thing for the top 20%. They held smaller and smaller amounts of income that was being produced by consumers. Engel's law, just realize that real income increases, the proportion of food spent on food declines. So as people's incomes increase, they don't buy. For example, if your income doubles, you don't spend twice as much on food. You consume other items at a higher rate. All right. So this just illustrates what we were talking about with Engel's law. Investment. All right. Although incomes rose, the availability of items to purchase was limited. Remember that even though we see people's income levels increasing, the war was going on and goods were rationed. Consumers couldn't buy all the things that they wanted to buy. All right, rationing. I actually have some rationing coupons from World War II, and they are, in essence, that. If you wanted to buy, for example, sugar, a certain amount of sugar, if you wanted to buy, let's say, 5 ounces of sugar, you would have to take 5 1-ounce coupons out of your coupon book in order to buy that sugar. Once you ran out of coupons, you couldn't buy that sugar anymore. So realize that even though income was going up, people did not have an outlet for that consumption. All right, goods were not available because of the shortages of wartime. So what ended up happening was that people's savings increased dramatically during World War II because as their incomes were going up, savings would naturally go up. But also, the fact that consumption would normally increase was dampened by the fact of wartime rationing and the fact that goods were not available for individuals. So that further increased savings rates. And you could take a look at this. What happens with personal savings? In 1940, personal savings was only for 4.4 billion, and by the end of the war, and by 1944, personal savings was close to 10 times that level. All right. So that savings, but this was not translated into the domestic investment. People were saving a lot more, but that didn't mean that that investment was being invested in a private manner. For example, building private homes or private businesses. Much of that personal savings was being funneled to the federal government to help pay for the war effort. So I want you to realize that personal savings rates went up, but that did not translate into increases in gross private domestic investment. That personal savings was channeled to the federal government in order to finance the war effort.